The Russian President Vladimir Putin has warned the British Prime Minister David Cameron not to supply arms to Syrian rebels. Speaking after their talks in London, Mr. Putin said the behaviour of the rebels was inconsistent with basic human values. But Mr. Cameron insisted that Britain and Russia could work together to end the conflict in Syria. Now, that comes as the men prepare to meet other world leaders at the G8 in Northern Ireland. Our diplomatic correspondent Bridget Kendall is there.
Heavy security around Enniskillen and the nearby Lochside Golf Hotel ahead of tomorrow's summit. Thousands of police deployed and miles of razor wire, literally a ring of steel. Given Northern Ireland's history, gathering G8 leaders here is inevitably a risk, but fears of local trouble isn't the only reason for tension. The widening chasm between Russia and the West over Syria has raised the stakes at this summit. In Downing Street this afternoon, the greeting was friendly enough, but the Russian president's smile looked strained. At this G8, Russia is more or less isolated, insisting on backing the Syrian president, while Western powers talk of direct military help for the opposition.
I believe that Assad is responsible for tearing his country apart, and that to end Syria's nightmare, he has to go. The new evidence this week of how the regime is gassing its people makes that clearer than ever.
But how could the West back the opposition, asked an infuriated Mr. Putin, when some rebels seem prepared to cannibalize their victims, at least according to one internet video.
And there's always a question, who is to be blamed for that? Who is to blame? I believe you will not deny the fact that one hardly should back those who kills their enemies and eat their organs and all that is filmed and shot. Do you want to support these people? Do you want to supply arms to these people?
You can see there are very big differences between the analysis we have of what happened in Syria and who is to blame. But where there is common ground is we both see a humanitarian catastrophe. We both see the dangers of instability and extremism. We both want to see a peace conference and a transition.
Already, the bulk of President Assad's heavy weaponry comes from Russia, including air defense systems. Now Moscow is threatening to supply even more advanced S-300 anti-aircraft missiles to protect Syrian forces against potential foreign air attacks. And on all sides, neighbours are being drawn in. From Lebanon, Hezbollah fighters reinforce Assad's troops. More Shia fighters and arms come from Iran and possibly Iraq too. The rebels so far rely on arms from Sunni allies in the Gulf. But the United States has placed Patriot missiles in Turkey to the north and now in Jordan to the south. Today, King Abdullah insisted that his country needed to be able to defend itself and confirmed that American Patriot missiles and F-16 fighter jets would remain in Jordan after this month's joint military exercises. G8 summits are supposed to bring together some of the world's most powerful leaders in a club of like-minded values and interests. But Syria blasts a huge hole in that. Instead, it's a face-off between Russia and the West over a conflict where they're poised to arm opposite sides. The only comfort is that unlike in the dangerous old days of the Cold War, they are prepared to get together in this remote spot to discuss it. Bridget Kendall, BBC News, at the G8 Loch Earn Summit in Northern Ireland.
Well, our diplomatic correspondent Jonathan Marcus is there as well. So, Jonathan, a delicate relationship between Russia and the UK as of today is now more problematic. How do they get to that litmus test of finding a political path out of the escalating violence in Syria?
That's a huge question, and of course the problem is that this difference over Syria, which is fundamental, basically Russia backs one side, the key Western powers back another. Russia simply doesn't accept the evidence, for example, that the Syrian government has been using chemical weapons, at least as far as the Americans, the French and the British are concerned. And the fear, of course, is that that's going to overshadow the whole of this summit. Now, they'll be talking about foreign policy, and that essentially means Syria tomorrow night at dinner. I think the tone will be difficult. The hope will be that they can at least try and focus, as Mr. Cameron was stressing today in Downing Street, on the possibility of an international conference. But as the fighting continues, as the balance of advantage on the ground seems to be shifting towards the government side, that conference is looking further and further away than ever.
A few weeks ago, Jonathan, Barack Obama was saying chemical weapons would be the game changer. So, therefore, the game has changed. Why? What is it about the Kremlin? What is it about Vladimir Putin that stops even the most basic kind of acknowledgement of that?
I think in fairness to the Russians, one would have to say that it's clear that the Syrian opposition is made up of many groups. Britain, for example, likes to stress those who want to see a democratic Syria, who want to see a country with full human rights and so on. The Russians, of course, are pointing to groups that are allied with Al Qaeda. They fear that the upshot of the removal of the Assad regime will simply be political turmoil and further crisis. The Russians, I think, all through the so-called Arab Spring have taken what they would see as a much more pragmatic view, a much more realistic view, as Moscow would have it. They think the West is being naive, that it's not really seeing what is in front of its eyes. And I think that's where this fundamental disagreement stems from.
Jonathan, thanks very much. Jonathan Marcus, our diplomatic correspondent in Northern Ireland.